I did not realize my own son was trying to take my house until I saw my name on a loan I never signed. The papers were clean, official, and convincing, but the signature was not mine. While I was making tea in the kitchen, they were planning my future behind closed doors. They spoke about helping me, about managing my affairs, as if my life were already slipping away. The hardest part was not the paperwork. It was realizing that the people I trusted most were quietly preparing to erase my voice, my choices, and everything I had built. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from. And as you watch, don't just sit back, be part of the experience. If a moment grabs your attention, whether it's powerful, unexpected, or deeply moving, drop a comment with the timestamp of that scene and share your thoughts. Your reactions bring the story to life, and we love seeing which moments resonate with you the most. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a coffee or tea, settle in, and let's begin. My name is Margaret Collins, and I have lived in the same wooden house by Lake Superior for over 30 years. The lake has always been my quiet companion, stretching wide and gray beneath the Minnesota sky, calm in the mornings and restless when the wind rolled in from the north. This house was where my husband and I raised our son, where we celebrated birthdays and endured winters that seemed to last forever. Even after my husband passed, the walls still felt warm with memory. My days were simple. I woke early, brewed a cup of tea, and watched the light spill across the water. I kept a small garden out back, mostly wildflowers that survived the cold better than anything else. In the afternoons, I read the local paper or listened to the radio while folding laundry. Life was quiet, but it was mine. The silence never felt empty. It felt earned. Everything changed when my son, Ethan, and his wife, Rachel, moved back in. They said it would only be temporary. Work had been unstable, rent was rising, and they needed time to get back on their feet. I welcomed them without hesitation. A mother does not question when her child needs help. I told myself the house was big enough for all of us. At first, their presence felt comforting. The kitchen was noisy again. The refrigerator emptied faster. I heard footsteps in the hallway at night. For a moment, I believed the house had returned to life. Then the changes began. Rachel replaced the old floral curtains with long white panels that brushed the floor. The framed photographs of my husband and me disappeared from the living room walls, replaced by abstract art and motivational quotes. The couch was pushed aside to make space for a ring light and camera tripod. They did not ask. They did not explain. They simply rearranged. Soon, the living room no longer felt like a place to sit and rest. It felt like a set. Ethan talked about content and branding, words that meant nothing to me but seemed to matter deeply to them. The house was no longer just a home. It was something to be displayed, marketed, and improved. I began spending more time in my bedroom, the only space that still felt untouched. The dresser was the same one my husband had built with his own hands. My nightstand held the same lamp I had used for decades. When I closed the door, I could almost pretend nothing had changed. But the sounds told a different story. Rachel's voice echoed down the hallway during her online recordings. Laughter, music, and the constant hum of electronics replaced the quiet I once cherished. Even the smell of the house changed. The familiar scent of wood and tea was now mixed with strong candles and sweet diffusers. Sometimes I stood in the kitchen, watching them move around as if the house belonged to them. They spoke confidently, making plans, discussing renovations, pointing out what should be updated. I nodded politely and kept my thoughts to myself. I had learned that silence kept the peace. Still, a strange feeling followed me from room to room. It was not anger, it was something softer and more unsettling. I felt like I was slowly being erased from my own life. One afternoon, as I watered the flowers by the lake, I looked back at the house and realized I no longer recognized it. The windows reflected the sky, bright and distant, but inside those walls, my place had begun to shrink. I told myself it was only temporary. Families adjust, people compromise. That was what I believed. Yet deep down, I sensed that the changes were not finished. The house was shifting, and so was my role within it. What I did not know then was how much of my life was about to be tested, and how quietly it would begin. If you are still watching and starting to sense that something is not right in this family, please comment number 1 below to let me know you are with me. Now let us move on to point number 2, where the first warning signs begin to appear. The feeling that something was off did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, like a draft through a closed window. After Ethan and Rachel had settled into the house, I began to notice small details I would have once ignored. Drawers were not quite how I left them. Papers were shifted. Envelopes sat at odd angles, as if someone had been searching for something specific. One morning, I opened the wooden cabinet where I kept my personal documents. My birth certificate, insurance records, and the deed to the house had always been neatly stacked in labeled folders. That day, the folders were still there, but the order was wrong. Some papers were upside down. Others were tucked into the wrong sections. A few envelopes had been opened and resealed with careless folds. I stood there longer than I meant to, my fingers resting on the edges of the files. Nothing was missing, at least not that I could tell, but the sense of privacy I had always trusted was gone. This cabinet had never been touched by anyone but me. Now it felt exposed. Later that afternoon, I checked the mailbox. Mixed in with my usual bills and local newsletters was a thick envelope from a bank. The name printed across the front was Ethan's, but the address was mine. The return label listed a financial institution in Duluth, one I did not recognize. I did not open it. I simply carried it inside and set it on the kitchen counter. Rachel noticed it almost immediately. She picked it up, glanced at the front, and slid it into her purse without a word. Her movements were smooth, practiced, as if this were completely normal. I said nothing, but a quiet question settled in my chest. Why was my home address being used for my son's financial business? Over the next few days, more mail arrived. Statements, notices, all addressed to Ethan. None explained what they were for, and none were discussed in front of me. The house had become a place where conversations stopped when I entered the room. One evening, while sorting through old magazines in the living room, I noticed a single sheet of the paper tucked between 2 catalogs. It was a photocopy of my property deed, not the original, which I kept locked away, but a clean recent copy with clear margins and sharp print. My name was there, along with the legal description of the land and the registration number. I stared at it for a long time. There was no reason for this copy to be lying out in the open. No one had asked for it. No one had told me it existed. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more meaning than ink and toner. That night, Rachel brought up the subject of simplifying things. She spoke gently, almost kindly, as she cleared the dinner dishes and wiped down the counter. She mentioned planning ahead, making sure everything was organized, and preparing for the unexpected. Her words were careful, but her eyes never left my face. She watched for a reaction, measuring my silence. I nodded politely, the way I always did. I had learned that questions only led to awkward explanations and subtle frustration. Still, her tone stayed with me long after the conversation ended. When I went to bed, I could not sleep. The house creaked in the wind, the lake waves tapping softly against the shore. Normally, those sounds comforted me. That night, They only reminded me how alone I felt inside my own walls. I began paying closer attention to everything: where papers were placed, who used the computer, what was being discussed behind closed doors. The warmth I once felt toward my son and his wife was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, a quiet unease I could not shake. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Families made changes. People handled money in private. There was probably a reasonable explanation for everything I had seen. Yet the feeling lingered. Something was happening in my house, and it had nothing to do with the new furniture or online videos. It had to do with control, and I was starting to realize that I was no longer the one who had it. If you are still watching and wondering what those hidden documents really mean, please comment number 2 below to let me know you are following closely. Now, let us move on to point number 3, where the truth becomes impossible to ignore. By the time Ethan brought the papers to me, I was already watching everything more carefully. I had stopped assuming the best and started noticing the details that once blended into the background. The way conversations paused when I entered the room, the way Rachel kept her laptop angled away from me, the way my own house no longer felt private. Ethan approached me one afternoon while I was folding laundry in the sunroom. He held a thin folder under his arm, his expression calm, almost casual. He explained that the documents were simply a temporary authorization, something that would allow him to help manage my finances if I ever needed assistance. He spoke as if this were a routine matter, the kind of thing responsible families did without question. I took the folder from him and skimmed the first page. The language was dense, filled with long sentences and unfamiliar terms. Words like control, authority, and property appeared more often than I liked. Nothing in the paperwork felt simple. It felt permanent. I told him I needed time to look it over. My voice stayed steady, but my hands were not. Ethan's smile tightened just slightly, the way it does when someone is disappointed but trying not to show it. He said there was no rush, yet the way he stood there suggested otherwise. That night, I did not sleep well. The lake wind rattled the windows, and the house creaked with every shift in temperature. I kept thinking about the folder, about how quickly my son had expected me to sign something I did not fully understand. The next morning, I opened the locked drawer where I kept older financial records. I wanted to compare the new paperwork with documents I trusted. As I flipped through the files, something unfamiliar caught my eye. It was a mortgage statement for a small loan, one I had never applied for. My name was printed neatly at the top, along with what appeared to be my signature. At first, I assumed I had forgotten. Age has a way of making you question your own memory. But the longer I stared at the signature, the more certain I became. The curves were wrong, the pressure was uneven. It looked like my name, but it did not feel like my hand. I took the statement to the bank later that day. The building was quiet, the air smelling faintly of carpet cleaner and paper. A clerk reviewed the document carefully, then compared it to older records on file. She did not say much, but her expression changed. She told me the signature was not an exact match and that further review would be required. I thanked her and walked out slowly, my steps heavy on the sidewalk. The cold air burned my lungs, but I barely noticed. My mind was focused on one thought that refused to leave. Someone had signed my name without my permission. By the time I reached home, my hands felt numb. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the table where we once ate family dinners without tension or secrets. The walls seemed to press in closer than they ever had before. The betrayal did not feel loud or dramatic. It felt quiet, like something breaking inside me without making a sound. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply sat there, realizing that the trust I had given so freely had been used against me. Ethan was not just my son. He was the child I had stayed up with during fevers, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the man I believed would always protect me. The idea that he could be involved in something like this made my chest ache in a way I had never known. Yet I said nothing. I did not confront him. I did not accuse Rachel. I watched instead. I listened. I paid attention to what was said and what was carefully left unsaid. If my name had already been used once without my consent, I knew it could happen again, and this time I would be ready. I folded the papers neatly, returned them to the drawer, and locked it. As I turned the key, a new thought settled in my mind. If my family was willing to cross this line, then I needed to protect myself, even if it meant standing alone. If you are still watching and feeling the weight of that betrayal, please comment number 3 below to let me know you are still here. Now, let us move on to point number 4, where silence becomes a powerful weapon. After the bank confirmed that the signature on the loan papers was not mine, the world around me shifted. Nothing in the house looked different, yet everything felt unfamiliar. The walls were the same. The lake still glimmered beyond the windows, but the sense of safety I once carried through each room was gone. I did not confront Ethan. I did not question Rachel. I understood instinctively that doing so would only teach them to hide their intentions better. If there was already deception in motion, then my silence was not weakness, it was protection. So I watched. I listened to the rhythm of the house the way one listens to weather, searching for patterns. Conversation stopped the moment I entered a room. Laptop screens were tilted away. Phone calls ended abruptly. Even simple exchanges felt rehearsed, as if every word had been measured before it reached my ears. Ethan no longer looked like the boy I had raised. He looked like a man guarding a plan. Rachel's smiles were still polite, but they carried an edge, the kind that forms when someone believes they are in control. I began to notice small things. The computer in the study was often left open to financial pages. The printer ran late at night. Envelopes appeared on the counter and vanished before morning. The house had become a place of quiet movement, like pieces shifting across a board. Privacy, once taken for granted, had disappeared. I moved carefully, as though the floor itself might betray me. My routine stayed the same, but my awareness sharpened. I locked my drawers. I kept my personal documents close. I avoided unnecessary conversations. What hurt most was not the suspicion. It was the realization that I could no longer see my own family as safe. One evening, as I passed the hallway, I heard Rachel's voice drifting from the living room. She was not speaking to me. Her words were casual, confident, as though she were discussing a project rather than a person's life. She mentioned managing things, making decisions on my behalf, and ensuring everything was handled properly. She did not say my name, but I felt it in every sentence. I kept walking, my steps quiet against the wooden floor. My heart beat steadily, not with panic, but with clarity. The doubt I had carried since the bank visit hardened into certainty. They were planning something. The house, once filled with shared memories, now felt like a space where intentions hid behind closed doors. Even the lake outside seemed different. The water moved slowly, as if waiting for something to break its surface. At night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house settling. Footsteps above me, a door closing, the soft hum of electronics. Every noise carried meaning now. Every silence felt deliberate. Yet I remained calm. I reminded myself that fear would only cloud my judgment. I needed to think clearly. If my name had already been used without my consent, then I had to assume nothing was off limits. The protection of my home, my future, and my independence depended on what I did next. I began considering my options quietly. No paperwork would be signed. No decisions would be rushed. and no trust would be given where it had already been broken. There was a strength in staying quiet, in letting others believe they were unseen. The less I revealed, the more they revealed themselves. Each day, I felt my role within the house shrinking, but my awareness expanding. I was no longer just a mother offering shelter. I was a woman learning how to defend what was hers. The silence I carried was not empty. It was deliberate. It held every observation, every doubt, and every growing certainty. Whatever Ethan and Rachel were planning, I would not walk into it unaware. And this time, I would be ready. If you are still watching and curious about how far this plan will go, please comment number 4 below to let me know you are ready for what comes next. Now let us move on to the moment everything starts to unravel. By the time the truth began to surface, I was no longer surprised by secrecy. What unsettled me was how openly my life was being discussed without my presence. The house felt quieter than ever, yet beneath that silence, decisions were being made. One afternoon, while Ethan and Rachel were out, I noticed the study door had been left slightly open. The printer tray was full, papers stacked neatly as if someone had been working in a hurry. I should not have looked, but curiosity had already taken root. The documents were from a real estate company in Duluth, Minnesota. They listed property values, market trends, and projected sale prices. My address appeared more than once. My home was described in the language of profit, not memory. No one had mentioned an appraisal. No one had asked for my permission. I set the papers back exactly where I found them and closed the door. My heart remained steady, but my thoughts moved quickly. The house was no longer just being reorganized. It was being evaluated. Later that evening, I saw Rachel scrolling through her phone in the kitchen. The screen flashed with images of the living room, the lake, and the back deck in the golden light of sunset. Captions spoke of fresh starts and new chapters. The comments were filled with compliments, people admiring a home they believed belonged to her. The photographs were beautiful, but they felt wrong. The rooms held decades of my life, yet they were being presented as a backdrop for someone else's future. The final piece of the puzzle arrived quietly. In the mail, among the usual envelopes, was a notice addressed to my name. It mentioned an upcoming evaluation, a review of my ability to manage my own affairs. The language was polite, clinical, and unsettling. No one had discussed this with me. The implication was clear. If I were deemed unfit to make decisions, someone else would step in. My choices would no longer be mine. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the lights in the rest of the house had gone dark. The lake outside reflected the moon, calm and distant. I thought about the papers, the photographs, and the appointment that had been arranged without my consent. Then I noticed another detail I had previously ignored. Rachel's movements had changed over the past few weeks. She walked more carefully. She avoided heavy lifting. Her hand often rested protectively against her stomach. It was subtle, but unmistakable. They were expecting a child. The realization shifted everything into focus. The urgency, the financial pressure, the sudden interest in property values. They were not simply planning for themselves. They were planning for a future that required stability, resources, and control. And my house was part of that plan. The thought did not fill me with anger. It filled me with clarity. My home was not a sentimental space to them. It was a solution. I felt the weight of betrayal settle in my chest, not as pain, but as resolve. If my own family was willing to reshape my life for their benefit, then I would have to protect myself with the same determination. I did not confront them. I did not reveal what I knew. There was no advantage in exposing my awareness. Silence, I had learned, was power. Instead, I began thinking carefully about what could not be taken from me: my independence, my legal authority, my right to decide what happened to my home. The lake wind pressed gently against the windows, a familiar sound that reminded me of everything this house had witnessed: love, loss, time. It had stood through storms before, and so had I. Whatever plans were being formed behind closed doors, I would not be caught unprepared. I would move quietly, deliberately, and on my own terms, because the moment had come to step ahead of them, not react to them, and I already knew where to begin. Once I understood the full weight of what Ethan and Rachel were planning, my fear faded into something steadier. I no longer felt like a confused mother watching her family drift away. I felt like a woman standing at a crossroads, fully aware of what was at stake. My home, my independence, and the life I had built were not abstract ideas. They were real, and they were mine to protect. I did not confront them. There was no benefit in revealing what I knew. Confrontation would only sharpen their defenses and force them to move faster. Instead, I continued with my routines, brewing tea in the mornings and tending to the garden by the lake. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I began researching quietly. I read about property trusts, elder protection laws, and legal structures designed to prevent financial exploitation. The more I learned, the clearer my path became. I needed a solution that could not be undone by pressure, manipulation, or forged signatures. I needed something permanent. That was when I thought of Howard. He had been our family's attorney years ago, back when my husband was still alive. He was thorough, calm, and respectful. Most importantly, he understood the value of protecting people, not just paperwork. I called his office from my bedroom late one evening, my voice low and careful. When he heard my name, his tone softened. We spoke quietly. I explained what I had discovered, what I suspected, and what I feared. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause, followed by a single sentence that confirmed what I already knew. A protective trust would secure my home beyond their reach. The process had to be done properly. It had to be legal, documented, and irreversible. And it had to happen without Ethan or Rachel knowing. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One night, a storm rolled in from the lake. Rain struck the windows in steady sheets, and the wind howled through the trees. Ethan and Rachel went to bed early, complaining about the weather and the noise. The house settled into silence. At exactly 2 a.m, I slipped on my coat and took my keys from the drawer. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. I drove through the empty streets of Duluth, the headlights cutting through the rain like narrow blades of light. The city felt distant, almost unreal, as if the world were holding its breath. Howard's office was softly lit, a single lamp glowing behind the front desk. He was waiting for me. The paperwork was already prepared. The trust documents were clear, precise, and final. My home would be placed into a legal structure designed to protect elderly homeowners from financial exploitation. I would retain the right to live there for the rest of my life, but ownership could no longer be transferred, borrowed against, or sold without strict legal safeguards. I read every page carefully. For the first time in months, the language of the documents felt reassuring rather than threatening. These words did not take anything from me. They gave something back. When I signed my name, it felt different than any signature I had written before. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just certainty. Outside, the rain continued to fall. The drive home was quiet. The streets were empty, the sky dark, the lake invisible beyond the trees. Yet I felt lighter than I had in a long time. The house waiting for me was no longer vulnerable. Neither was I. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Everything looked the same: the furniture, the walls, the familiar shadows in the hallway, but the balance of power had shifted. I removed my coat, hung it by the door, and walked through the room slowly. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. Ethan and Rachel slept upstairs, unaware that their plans had already unraveled. By morning, nothing would appear different. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The house was protected, my future secured, and my independence restored. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly in control. If you are still watching and want to see how the consequences finally unfold, please comment number 6 below to let me know you are with me. Now, let us move on to chapter 7, where the truth hits hard. The morning after the storm felt ordinary, almost deceptively so. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, glinting off the lake beyond the trees. The house looked exactly as it had the day before, yet I moved through it with a different kind of calm, one rooted in certainty rather than habit. Ethan came downstairs with a confidence I had not seen in him for weeks. He spoke about a notary arriving later that morning, explaining that there were a few final documents to take care of. His tone suggested everything was already settled. I nodded, poured my tea, and said nothing. There was no need to argue when the outcome had already been decided. By late morning, a car pulled into the driveway. The visitor stepped inside with a leather folder tucked under one arm. Papers were placed on the dining table, crisp and official. Ethan stood close, watching carefully, while Rachel lingered near the doorway, her posture tight, her eyes sharp. They expected me to hesitate. They expected confusion. Instead, I sat down calmly and folded my hands. When the notary began explaining the purpose of the documents, I gently interrupted and asked him to contact my attorney. The room shifted. Ethan's confidence wavered, just slightly, as though a piece of his plan had slipped out of place. Howard's voice came through the speakerphone, steady and clear. He explained that the property had already been transferred into a protective trust during the early hours of the previous morning. The trust ensured I retained the right to live in my home for the rest of my life, while preventing any unauthorized transfers, loans, or sales. The documents Ethan had prepared no longer carried legal weight. The silence that followed felt heavier than any storm. Rachel's expression hardened, her composure cracking as frustration surfaced. Ethan stared at the table, his shoulders tense, his certainty drained away. I did not feel triumphant. I felt relieved. For months, I had lived in a state of quiet vigilance, measuring every word, watching every movement. Now, that weight lifted. The house no longer felt like a place of negotiation. It felt like mine again. No one raised their voice. No accusations were thrown. The tension spoke louder than any argument could have. Plans that had once felt inevitable were suddenly powerless. After the notary left, the house fell into an unfamiliar silence. The hum of electronics, the constant conversations, the whispered planning all disappeared. Even the lake seemed quieter, its surface smooth and reflective. I returned to my usual routine. I rinsed my teacup, wiped the counter, and stepped onto the porch to breathe in the crisp air. The wind carried the scent of water and pine, grounding me in a way I had not felt in a long time. Inside, Ethan and Rachel avoided my eyes. Their movements were stiff, uncertain. The confidence that once filled their voices had faded into careful restraint. I did not seek confrontation. My goal had never been to punish them. I only wanted to protect what was mine and preserve the life I had built. The outcome spoke for itself. That evening, the house felt different again, but not in the way it had before. The tension had not vanished entirely, yet it no longer threatened my sense of security. The walls seemed to hold their shape, as though relieved to return to their original purpose. I sat by the window and watched the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon. The water reflected soft shades of gold and blue, calm and steady. Whatever came next would not be easy. There would be questions, explanations, and consequences beyond this day. But for now, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The house was safe, and so was I. The house felt different after the notary visit, as if the walls themselves had released a long-held breath. The constant tension that once lingered in every corner had faded, replaced by an unfamiliar quiet. No more whispered conversations, no more late-night printing, no more careful glances in my direction. A few days later, the consequences began to unfold beyond our front door. An investigation was opened regarding the forged signature and the misuse of my financial records. Officers came to speak with me, calm and professional, asking for documents and timelines. I provided everything I had, my hands steady even as my heart felt heavier than I expected. The process was not easy. Recounting the details made the betrayal feel real all over again. Still, I knew it was necessary. Silence had protected me once. Now, truth had to do the rest. Rachel did not stay for long. One morning, her suitcase was gone from the hallway. The diffuser she loved, the candles, and the framed print she had hung so carefully had vanished with her. There was no explanation, no goodbye. The house simply absorbed her absence, as if she had never been there at all. Ethan remained, but he was no longer the man who once walked through the rooms with confidence. His steps were slower, his voice quieter. He avoided the kitchen when I was there, choosing instead to stay in his room or leave the house for long stretches of time. The distance between us was not measured in walls, but in silence. We did not speak about what had happened. There were no apologies, no excuses, only the quiet acknowledgement that something had been broken in a way that words could not repair. After a week of living in that silence, I made a decision. I asked Ethan to move out, not in anger, not in punishment, simply in self-preservation. I needed my home to feel safe again. I needed space to breathe without wondering what might be happening behind closed doors. He did not argue. His eyes reflected exhaustion more than resistance. When he left, the house felt empty, but not lonely. The lake returned to being my main companion. I spent mornings on the porch, wrapped in a sweater, watching the water ripple under the rising sun. The familiar sounds of birds and wind replaced the hum of electronics. The scent of fresh air replaced artificial fragrance. Inside, I began restoring the house to what it once was. Family photographs returned to the walls. The furniture shifted back into place. The living room became a place to sit, not perform. Each small change felt like a quiet reclaiming of myself. Emotionally, I felt neither victorious nor defeated. What I felt was steady. There was sadness, of course. A mother never stops caring for her child, even when trust is lost. But there was also relief, a gentle sense of closure that allowed me to move forward without fear. I no longer questioned my instincts. I had protected my home, my independence, and my future. The cost had been high, but the lesson was clear. Peace does not come from avoiding conflict. It comes from choosing yourself when no one else will. And for the first time in a long while, the house felt like mine again. If you are still watching and ready to see how this story truly ends, please comment number 8 below to let me know you made it this far. Now let us move on to the final chapters and the conclusion of this journey. The house felt different once I was alone again. Not empty, not silent in a lonely way, but settled. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed and the air finally clears. No footsteps overhead, No low conversations behind closed doors, no tension hiding in the corners. Just the steady rhythm of the lake and the soft creak of old floorboards. I began restoring the room slowly, one memory at a time. The framed photograph of my husband and me, taken on a windy summer day by the water, returned to the living room wall. I wiped the glass carefully before hanging it, as if the years themselves had gathered dust. Seeing his familiar smile again brought a warmth I had not realized I missed so deeply. The furniture shifted back to where it once belonged. The living room became a place for sitting, not staging. The sunlight stretched across the rug in the afternoons, uninterrupted by ring lights or camera stands. Even the air felt cleaner, without artificial scents masking the natural smell of wood and lake water. Outside, my garden welcomed me back. The soil was cool beneath my gloves as I trimmed the wildflowers and cleared away fallen leaves. The wind carried the fresh scent of water and pine, steady and grounding. Each small task reminded me that growth did not need permission. It only needed care. In time, I opened my home to others again, but on my own terms. A few neighbors from the nearby community center joined me once a week for quiet painting sessions. We sat by the windows, brushes moving gently across canvas, sharing silence more than conversation. The house no longer felt like something to be used. It felt like a place to belong. Emotionally, I felt steady. There was sadness, of course. A mother never stops loving her child, even when trust has been broken. But the grief was softer now, no longer sharp or overwhelming. It rested quietly beside acceptance. I no longer questioned my instincts or my choices. Protecting myself had not made me cold. It had made me strong. In the evenings, I often sat on the porch, wrapped in a sweater, watching the lake reflect the fading light. The water moved gently, never rushed, never forced. It reminded me that peace does not arrive suddenly. It settles in, little by little. The future no longer felt uncertain. It felt open. And for the first time in a long while, I was not afraid to face it alone. The house was quiet, in a way that felt natural now, not forced. Sunlight drifted through the windows, warming the wooden floors and softening the shadows along the walls. I moved through the rooms slowly, not because I was tired, but because I no longer felt rushed. There was nothing to escape from anymore. When I thought about everything that had happened, I did not feel anger. I felt clarity. For a long time, I had mistaken patience for strength, and silence for peace. I believed that keeping harmony meant accepting discomfort. What I learned instead was that peace only exists when your boundaries are respected. Age had taught me more than I ever realized. It taught me how to recognize patterns, how to listen without reacting, and how to act without seeking approval. Being older did not make me weaker. It made me more aware. I had lived long enough to know the difference between love and control. Family is often described as a place of safety, but safety does not come from blood alone. It comes from respect. It comes from honesty. And it comes from understanding that care should never feel like pressure. When those things disappear, even the closest relationships can become harmful. Protecting myself did not mean I stopped loving my son. It meant I stopped allowing my love to be used against me. There is a difference between sacrifice and surrender. One is chosen. The other is taken. I learned that silence can be powerful, but only when it is paired with awareness. Silence alone can hide pain. Awareness turns it into strength. Knowledge, patience, and preparation gave me back control over my own life. There was no dramatic victory, no loud confrontation, no celebration, just a quiet return to myself. And that was enough. In the evenings, I often sat by the lake, watching the water shift under the fading light. The surface was never still for long, yet it always found its balance again. I like to think I had done the same. Life does not promise us fairness, even within our own families, but it does offer us choice. The choice to protect our dignity, the choice to demand respect, and the choice to walk forward without carrying the weight of someone else's expectations. My story was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming my voice. And in the quiet of my home, surrounded by the life I built, I finally heard it clearly. Sometimes life teaches its hardest lessons in silence, not through dramatic moments, but through quiet realizations that reshape how we see ourselves and the people around us. True strength is not found in confrontation alone, but in knowing when to protect your peace, your dignity, and your independence. Respect should never feel conditional, and love should never come at the cost of self-worth. Every chapter, no matter how painful, carries the chance to reclaim control and move forward with clarity. Growth often begins the moment we choose ourselves without guilt. Thank you for taking the time to experience this story. If it resonated with you, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters, and your voice is part of this community. Please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing for more meaningful stories that explore resilience, self-respect, and the power of personal choice.